Well, hey guys, how are you? This is Kim Anderson coming to you on behalf of the Founding Project in relation to our Civics for All Ages online civics course. And so I am experimenting today. I am using another venue for recording, and I'm hoping that this comes through loud and clear. If it looks like I am, like locked in, I'm actually like on my patio. And it seems like when I start to do these videos, like it gets overcast. And so I'm hoping that the sun comes back out because inside I'm going to have to get better lighting equipment so that I can have the light on me so that you can see me how I want you to see me, and so that I don't get discombobulated about the other stuff when I want to just get information to you. And so today our continued civics lesson is on the separation of powers and checks and balances. And whenever you'll be watching this video, it will be relevant to what's going on in our country today. There's some things I could talk about, but I don't want to date the video. But it's relevant. It's always going to be relevant because we're always learning and we're always seeing government in action. And so it's good to know constitutionally, civics wise, like what's actually supposed to be happening. And then once you have this understanding and once you have the knowledge, you can sort of cipher through all the stuff that's going on politically right now when we're seeing our government in action, to see who's overstepping, who's not stepping up like they should be, who's doing what, where, and maybe they should push back or pull up. And you'll be able to see that once you have some understanding of civics and how our government was created to function. So let's dive in and talk a little bit today about separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, excuse me, I didn't mean for that to be a commercial, but it is what it is. All right, so the background of the philosophy of checks and balances and separation of powers came from a French gentleman called Montesquieu. And when we talked earlier, I've got my book off camera, my notes off camera. And let me just say for the record that we are using the Alpha Omega Publishing civics coursework for our continuing education. Okay. And so in our previous lessons on the constitutions and the articles and the preamble, we talked about those first basic functions of the Constitution, right? The preamble and the various articles. But the understanding and the philosophy of separation of powers came from Montesquieu back in the 18th century. Now, Montesquieu is obviously a French name, and Montesquieu began to develop these theories of government with the separation of powers because he was critical of the French monarchy. Now, isn't that interesting? Didn't our founding fathers have something against the monarchy? It seems that that form of government led men to aspire to something more and better for the people of their country. Like those that came from a monarchy, and I don't want to say an oppressive monarchy, but monarchies maybe centuries ago tended to be oppressive. Because there was only one law. There was one monarch, male or female. They were the law. And so because of those observations of the French monarchy at the time, Montesquieu began to develop these philosophies and theories about separation of powers. And so Montesquieu did that political liberty should be preserved, and that to assure protection, there should be an appropriate means to prevent the abuse of power by those in authority. Don't you hear that theme being repeated again and again throughout the historical perspectives of this civics lesson? It's amazing. And so in 1748, Montesquieu developed his concept of the three branches of government, and they might sound familiar to you. They were the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. I mean, like, does this sound like remotely familiar? And it was the responsibility of the legislative branch to make the laws, change them, or repeal them. It was the duty of the executive branch to make sure that the laws were enforced and properly executed. And the judicial branch was to be held accountable for interpreting the law and applying it to specific cases. I mean, it seems like we've heard that before, right? And so he also came up with the concept of checks and balances, meaning that there must be something where each branch can check the other, so that there's no runaway branch of government, but that each branch can be checked and their power can be subjugated one to another. And so checks basically means the processes by which each branch oversees the activities of the other. And the term balance means the ability of each branch to exercise its authority over the other, just to make sure that no one runs away with the power and the authority in a particular country. Well, it just so happens that that form of government was implemented in our Constitution. And so the interesting part was knowing that concept and implementing that concept centuries ago was a very, very different thing. Like Montesquieu had the idea, but no one previously had implemented it, because if you were a monarch, would you want power and authority taken from you? Like they weren't all of a sudden going to say, you know what? I think we should have three branches of government, and I should step down to my authority. No, not so fast. So it was a theory that at the time, the founding fathers, when they were establishing and writing the Constitution, they were like, you know what? I think this might work for us, right? Like they were like, I think since we're starting from scratch and we're going to do all this brand new, I'm thinking this philosophy here might actually work for us. And so the goal of the writers of the Constitution was to avoid the possibility of an individual or a group usurping complete control of the government, forming a dictatorship, or some other acceptable form of government. That was their whole thing. You guys know that. You know how staunchly they were against any form of oppressive rule. They just had lived it, been there, done that. They just were absolutely opposed to anything that would come to resemble some oppressive form of government. They just weren't having it. And so on a federal level, we have in the Constitution the checks and balances. We have those three forms of government. And we have them in practical terms, not just theory. We have them in practical terms. And we talked about that a little bit in our last lesson. And so the key factor was that no branch of the government was granted absolute authority, and every effort was made to keep that from happening in the future. And so let's just sort of give some examples quickly of how the checks and balances work. So, number one, Congress has been given the authority to pass bills relating to any matter that may come before them. Number two, the president has the responsibility to either sign the bill into law or to veto it. If he signs it into law, it is then the duty of the judicial branch to be prepared to determine if that law conforms to the limitations, quote, 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 the limitations of the Constitution. Meaning the law should be able to be executed within the framework of the Constitution. If it does not, they kick it out and say it's unconstitutional. Therefore, that law cannot stand here in the United States. See how that's supposed to work? Now, only those laws that are challenged at some time are brought before the courts. So it doesn't mean they review every single solitary law. They just review the ones that might be the outliers. And they say, hey, let's look at that to make sure that that's falling in line with the Constitution. Now, if a bill is vetoed by the president, I don't know what number we're on. I think we're on number 4. If a bill is vetoed by the president, it may then be returned to Congress, whereby a 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress can override the president's veto. And that, my friends, is very hard to do. It does not happen often that a president vetoes it and then Congress comes back with override authority and then overrides the president. Because usually what will happen is if a president knows that a law has that many votes and that it can pass, and he may be against it. He may sign it anyway because he doesn't want his veto authority to be to be overridden by Congress. And so it's really rare that there's a congressional override of a bill that a president has vetoed, especially in modern times. I can't say what might have happened in the 20th century, but in modern politics, it's very rare that we see that. But Congress still does have that authority to override a presidential veto. Now, if that happens, and if Congress does actually override a presidential veto of a bill, it automatically becomes law without the president's signature. Each of those steps is an example of a check upon the other. Another check that we hear about is the impeachment process. If a president performs some act that is illegal or serious enough to be considered for removal from office, the House of Representatives then votes on whether the president should be impeached. If he is impeached, then the Senate will hold a hearing to determine if he should be removed from office. And the same holds true for appointees in the judicial branch, because those judicial appointments on a federal level are for life. And as a safeguard against a runaway jurist, Congress still has, got a little tickle. Congress still does have impeachment authority over the judicial branch. Now, we, the people, have authority over Congress, over the House and the Senate. If they're not doing what we want, every 2 years we can vote the House out. Every 6 years we can vote our senator out. So we really, really got to be careful about the Senate, because once the senators are seated, their terms are longer. So we still have that right, but it takes a while to remove a senator that's not doing so great. So FYI. And then, of course, we also have the authority with the president. Got it? See how that works? All right. Now, the Constitution also establishes certain powers that pertain only to the federal government. And those powers are called delegated or express powers, which means they are directly assigned to and from and by the federal government. Some of those, let me just take a swig of water. Woo! Some of those powers and authorities are, and it's funny because sometimes we just take this stuff for granted, but it's been granted to them in the Constitution. Coining money, making treaties with foreign nationals, regulating interstate commerce, establishing voting privileges in keeping with the Constitution and particularly the 14th Amendment, enforcing the spirit and the intent of the Bill of Rights. Those are some of the things that the federal government is responsible for based on the Constitution. Now, those are express powers. They also have implied powers, which means that the Constitution may not have actually spelled it out, but it's implied because of what it did spell out. Meaning, like, Congress has not been given the right to print paper money, but because it's assumed that they do, because they were given the responsibility to coin money. Well, not all money is coins. Money sometimes now is in paper bills, but because they had the initial right, they have taken the next step. It's implied that that's their responsibility. And so we also have what's called reserved powers. And these are powers which were not delegated nationally, but might be considered something that gets picked up by the states. Meaning it's something that they both can do. Let me make sure I'm reading that right. Concurrent powers are something that they both can do. Meaning both the federal and state governments can collect tax, but a state can't declare war. States can get into agreements with other states. There's public safety for states, education, marriage and divorce, licensing drivers. Those are more state government regulated than federal government regulated. But taxes apply to both, because there's federal taxes and state taxes and even local taxes in some cases, right? And so then on the other, so those would be considered concurrent, meaning that they both have the right to do it. And it's amazing, though we're free citizens, we've got lots of layers of governmental authority that sort of govern us. We have, and we don't think about it, but we just sort of we sort of walk in through it day to day, because there are state laws and there are federal laws and there are even local laws that we are subject to in our freedom. Isn't that interesting? Okay, and so the Constitution clearly delineates powers that forbid the federal government to enact laws upon the states. For example, the federal government cannot abolish a state, though it might not always be a bad idea. Did I say that out loud? Nor can it violate the principles established in the 10th Amendment. And so for review, I have it over there, but for review, go back and check out the 10th Amendment. It's really short. Let me see if I can pull it up really quick and tell you what that says. Da, 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 da. See, as you go through civics, it's really helpful to have these handy dandy pocket constitutions and stuff. The 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In essence, whatever isn't spelled out specifically may be used by states, and if it's not specifically for states, it can be something that's granted to the people. So, and the 14th Amendment says who can vote, and it's got a lot of separate articles in the 14th Amendment worth your read. All right, guys. So we've talked a little bit about separation of powers. We've discovered that it was initially thought up and theorized by Montesquieu. I want to say a French guy. That's not really, a French gentleman who really did not like where the French monarchy was leading and how they were governing the people. Thought there could be a better way. Came up with with checks and balances and separation of powers. We implemented that into our Constitution. Our founding fathers did, and we discovered that in our Constitution that there are delegated and express powers that are reserved specifically for the federal government, that there are concurrent powers that can be state and federal, and reserve powers. So, guys, that is it for our lesson for today. Now, let me tell you what's coming up. We're going to be talking about amendments and how we actually change the Constitution. We'll be talking about the protection of the Bill of Rights and the interpretation of the Bill of Rights. So we got some really interesting, juicy discussions coming up. And I hope you will stick around with us. This has been Kim Anderson on behalf of the Founding Project, coming to you from Central Florida, where it's a little bit overcast today, but you know what? It's still good to be here in the US of A, learning about civics, learning about how our government works. And so we will be back real soon with our next video. Share this video, go to thefoundingproject.com, and let's help as many citizens begin to understand the real beauty and value of American citizenship. It is truly, truly unique and a privilege. All right, guys, I will talk to you soon. Have a great one. Bye-bye.